Dr. William Anthony Thomas, we generally just call Tony, is here to talk about Mariology. And Tony, you're going to have to put your headphones on if you're going to be able to take direction and questions. There we go.
There we go.
Okay. So, Mariology, we titled this Ask a Mariologist, and you are in fact a Mariologist, a person who specializes in the theology of Mary and its relationship with other branches of theology such as ecclesiology, Christology, and so on. And I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with this discipline because it's not talked about too much. It's often subsumed under Christology or ecclesiology and different aspects of it, and so we don't hear that much about it. But as it turns out, the Holy See has a whole institute and an international academy dedicated to the study of Mariology. Tell us a little bit about that.
The Pontifical Marian Academy International, otherwise known as PAMI, is a pontifical academy that was founded in 1954 during the Marian year. It amalgamated several other academies, the Academy of the Immaculate Conception, the Academy of Mary, and so on. And it invites experts around the world, ideally passionate experts, scholars, to study the theology of Mary, her role, her inseparable role, to formulate some understanding of who she is, what she is, and how important she is in the life of the Church, in the life of the individuals. And so part of our brief is to be academic and pastoral. Pastoral in the sense that we organize major conferences, symposiums, by inviting many experts around the world to present papers, to launch study programs, which I am doing with the Marian Institute in Chicago, which is a wonderful institute for the promotion of Marian studies. And likewise in Fátima, we have the Pope John Paul Institute of Marian Studies, which is now turning into a university in conjunction with the authorities in Fátima itself. That's a bit down the tracks, if you want.
Down the road, sure.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's a very exciting area of study because we examine apparitions around the world. We examine Mariophanies around the world. I was recently in Egypt on behalf of the Academy to have a look at certain events that happened there in the past. We also, in our September meeting in Rome, studied 300 so-called apparitions, if you want, but we found a negative judgment on all of them. And we get many huge input from different people who say they have Marian apparitions. So we look at them both from a supernatural point of view, the actualities, the parapsychological aspects of where people are coming from, and so on and so forth. So it's an intense study. It's a constant study. It's an extremely interesting aspect to be in. And if people are interested in this line of study, I'd like to hear from them.
You know, and I think a lot of people, of course, are non-Catholic Christians, Protestants in particular, certainly not the Orthodox, look a little bit askance at, the role of Mary in the light of salvation history and so on and so forth. But I think in our own day, because we're both so much involved related to Fátima and giving conferences on that subject and trying to understand the depth of what happened at Fátima, with this role of Mary in relationship to redemption. And it really begins, if you look at in the Trinity, doesn't it, with the fact that here you have a communion of the divine persons, which is then given a created reality in the creation of Adam and Eve. a reality which the redemption, ruined by sin, but a reality that needed to be redeemed. And how that redemption is exemplified in the mother and the son and the union of charity, the bond of love, the bond of truth that united them in the very incarnation of the Word, of the eternal Word. And so that role continues through history, and at the end of history, we're told by St. John in his book of Revelation that the universe will be summed up in the wedding feast of the Lamb, the bridegroom and the groom together. And again, we see this nuptial union that will exist between God and man, and that's exemplified again in marriage, and particularly in the union of hearts between Mary and her son, the most perfect conformity of wills in history. Talk a little bit about that, because I think it explains the whole arc of history from the beginning to the end, through the incarnation at the peak, if you will, and the redemption, and how we can apply that lens to other questions of Mary that come up in the course of the Church's life.
Well, right at the beginning, as we see the account of creation in Genesis, during the first 5 days, God saw things were good that he had created. And on the 6th day, he created man, a unique entity, if you want. But there's something very special about it, because we find in the text that God says, "Let us make man in our image and likeness." So now we're saying, "Let us," whereas before God created, or God said, "Let there be light." Now we have this plurality of so there's an indicative that there's more in God than one person. So now we're looking at two, and of course the Spirit hovered over the earth, there's three. So already you can see in Genesis there's a Trinity. I suppose at that time it was probably not understood as we understood it today, as we understand it today. Okay, so God creates man. Let us make man in our image and likeness. There's a very interesting entity here. Let us make Saint Peter Chrysologus, that doctor of the Church, would say that the first Adam as we know him, was formed by the second Adam in his own image and likeness. And, you know, I would deduce from that Adam, if you want, was a twin of Jesus, you know, in his own image and likeness. Now, when God creates Adam, of course, we have this entity of God creating majesty. We know from some of the mystics, the Venerable Mary of Agreda, the Catherine Emmerich, Peter Chrysologus, and many of these doctors of the Church, that Adam was majestic. He beamed with light. And this is what God had intended. But unfortunately, the devil was lurking around, seeking how to undo the goodness of God, and found the weak link in Eve, and said, "You will be like God if you do this." This is exactly what happened with the war in heaven, so to speak. Lucifer, the bearer of light,
Michael throws out of heaven.
And so man falls. And what happens? The light of God that was in him was extinguished, and he discovered his nakedness. Now, this is a very important point, because now man needs to be redeemed by being restored by grace. It's a felix culpa, if you want. It's a felix culpa because we are not called eternally to be sons of Adam, but adopted sons of God. So the calling is even higher. And right there in Genesis, we have what we call the proto-evangelium, the first gospel of salvation, that the woman will come to crush the head of the serpent who undid God's goodness. And so right through the Old Testament then, we're going to see a prefigurement both of the Messiah who's going to come and of the woman who's going to be closely paralleled with him. Simply in her own prefigurement, we are going to see that in the Old Testament there are 27 what we call the matriarchs
who are going to
prefigure
Our Lady.
Our Lady.
Yeah. So we have then here, as we go to a break, this notion that man is not created in just isolation, but man and woman together, and it's man and woman together that must be redeemed. And we'll pick that up after this break.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television. Join our conversation with your question or comment. Call us toll-free, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside the U.S. and Canada, call 1-205-271-2985 or send us an email, etr@ewtn.com.
Well, we're back. I'm Colin Donovan here with Dr. Tony Thomas, a Mariologist from Ireland and Rome, and a little bit of all over. And we're asking questions about Mary, and we do want to get to your questions. So let me give you the phone numbers as Tom Price just did. Again, I'll give those. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Or if you're outside North America, country code 1-205-271-2985. Country code 1-205-271-2985. And you can, if you're watching us on YouTube or EWTN Radio's Facebook page, where we're streaming live, you can also ask questions in those comm boxes. And you can also text us questions at 55000. Wait for us to come back to you and then give us your name, your first name, and your question. So we do want to get to calls, but I think we need to finish this point of the unity of the hearts. And you were talking about the matriarchs. Of course, we know there are 4 women in the genealogy, which is given in Scripture. Well, I won't try to recite them all.
Yes.
I'll let you recite them.
So basically, I was alluding to the prefigurement of Our Lady in the Old Testament, which has never been rescinded. It's still a valid testimony, if you want. And it shows salvation history right from the beginning up until the New Testament in our own day, if you want. So of the 27, 14 of them were major matriarchs and 13 minor. Of the 14, we have some extraordinary women like Deborah, who was guided by God to be the wise woman and the counsel, and was able to do this, that, and the other in God's way. And guide the people of Israel, the people of God, the chosen people, and so on. And likewise, we have Queen Esther, who gives of her life to save her people, and so on. And all the way through, you find that there's a prefigurement of Our Lady. And then, in the fullness of time, according to God's plan, she is born without the stain of sin. As Duns Scotus would say, she receives in anticipation of the redemption all of the graces of the crucified Christ, who will be her son. And her heart, this is the important where I'm coming to, her heart is formed by the Trinity. Her heart is formed by the Father in the image of his Son, and she also possesses in a mystical way the heart of her Son, and formed also by the Holy Spirit. So her heart is immaculate, it's pure. And, you know, the great writer St. John a Eudes writes in the admirable Heart of Mary that, and this is a compendium of all the teachings up to the time of St. John a Eudes, Doctor of the Church, that the admirable heart of Mary is the most perfect heart that perfectly mirrors the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And it's the most profound heart, of which there is no other profundity. You know, there's two things I want to say about that. Many people ask from time to time, how do I progress in the spiritual life? Well, you have to start virtuously with the virtue of humility. Our Lady is known, as she says in her great Canticle of the Soul, the Almighty has looked upon his servant in her lowliness. And therefore she is profoundly humble. There's no other depth to humility she could have gone to. And because of her profound humility, she was invisible to the devil. And so this heart of hers, this immaculate heart of hers, perfectly is configured and mirrors the Sacred Heart of Jesus. They become inseparable. Her will is united hypostatically, if you want. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's united with the heart of her Son. And of all of creation, the greatest of God's creation is the humanity of Jesus, hypostatically united with the Blessed Trinity, and secondly, the hypostatically united to the Blessed Trinity, the second greatest creation was Our Lady. And many theologians would say that God created the world for her.
Well, if you think about it, there has to be sort of a prima and a secunda in God's intention, because if, as many of the fathers suggest, the trial of the angels, of the first children of God, if you will, the trial revolved around the incarnation, then there is already, and as St. Paul tells us, the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, this is Christ. You could not have had a Christ without God's own special intention to create she who would be the mother of that Word made flesh. And that's an inseparable thing, must be in the mind of the Father, in the plan of the Father from the very beginning, at the incipio of the judgment decision to create. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a lot there for theologians to study. Well, let's take some questions and see where they lead. We really do want you to call it. It can be on the subjects we're talking about, or it can be just maybe a question about Our Lady that you've always wanted to ask. And let's go first to Barb in Minneapolis, Minnesota, listening on Real Presence Radio. Good afternoon, Barb. Hello, are you there? Okay, well, let's go to Dominic then in Des Moines, Iowa, listening on Iowa Catholic Radio. Good afternoon, Dominic.
Hi, how are you?
Pretty good. What's your question today?
Okay, I have family members part of a group that's called the Army of Mary. They're out of Canada, Quebec, Canada. Actually, it's all my siblings, not all my siblings, but anyway, most of my family members are part of this group, and they, I'm not sure if you've heard of them or not. Mm-hmm. And a little background, it's founded in the mid-70s by a lady named Mariology, and she started this community and claimed to have had visions and speaking with God and Jesus and Mary in particular. It was a pious association at first, and then it became excommunicated, and because of some of their theology and some of the books that were being presented by one of the writers called Mark Osgard. Anyhow, a lot of this was not theologically sound, so the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, I believe, studied it and all this stuff. There's been letters back and forth. My question, I guess, would be if you have any information on this group in particular, or sect, I guess, and how I can approach my family members, because they claim it's a Marian, very Marian movement. They're very pious in respect. They say their rosary daily. They're 15 decades. They do adoration. They do penance. Like I was brought up in this religious group. So it's very something that's, I see my family members, and it's very dear to my heart in respect to my upbringing, but because of the schism that was caused, because of they believe that there's 5 people in the Trinity, the founders being one of them, and she's the reincarnation of Mary, for example.
Yeah, there are quite a few issues with that. That's the one that I remember the most from 15 years ago now, perhaps, when that action was taken against them. And they had other connections. I think they were quite connected with the group in Bayside, New York, promoting the so-called private revelations of Veronica Lucan. So there's some interconnections with Marian groups as well. Your insights on all of that?
I know of this group. I knew them. I met them. I saw Marie Paul in Rome back in the 80s when she went to Santa Maria Maggiore in the presence of Pope St. John Paul II. She was a member of the congregation there for a mass. And they had a very nice habit, a blue scapular, white habit, and they all looked very smart and so on. But their theology is upside down. She believed she was the reincarnation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and ultimately her own community declared her to be God. And so they're completely off the wall theologically, and they could never be accepted as Catholic, despite the fact that they say the Rosary. I think that they are excommunicated. 25,000 of them were excommunicated in one fell swoop, so to speak. It's very difficult unless they change their whole theology. I certainly wouldn't approach them because of the risk of conflict in dialogue with them. They'd really have to be re-educated in Catholic theology to call themselves Catholic and to eat humble pie and admit that they've got it wrong.
Well, it seems that there's so many illogical considerations. Just the idea of Mary, whom we believe by faith is body and soul in heaven. If you have a body and it's a glorified body, you're in heaven. There's no such thing as, becoming an incarnation of. It would be a reincarnation, something which quite clearly St. Paul, or the author of Hebrews, says, appointed to man to die once, after that the judgment. And on that basis, the Church has condemned any kind of reincarnational idea. And so how do you argue with people who won't accept the most basic teachings of the Church, which straightforwardly contradict? So I have to agree completely with Tony that I'm wondering about the possibility of any kind of useful interaction there. I think prayer and penance, which you learned as a child, can usefully be applied to that. This is a very strong delusion. Well, let's go to Jim in Jacksonville, Illinois, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Good afternoon, Jim.
Good afternoon, Colin. Thanks for taking my call. I was wondering if your guest could talk about Our Lady of Zaytun and those appearances were fairly recent, and why the appearances were even broadcast on Egyptian TV, and there were several Muslim conversions to Christianity, and then all of a sudden it kind of just dropped off the map. No more conversions, and you don't hear much about it anymore.
Sure, yeah. Well, maybe a little historical setting. In the 60s, an image, 62, it appeared that something was appearing above the gable of a church or a steeple of a church. The Coptic Orthodox Patriarch, or Pope as they call him, accepted it as real, and Paul VI made no decision about it, said it's not our jurisdiction, but we'll talk about it. And it's not apparently our time to talk about it, so we'll pick it up after the break. But it's fortuitous, obviously, that you were just there looking at this for the Pontifical Marian Academy.
Yes.
So we'll have something to say on that when we get back from our break in just a couple minutes.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television. Join our conversation with your question or comment. Call us toll-free, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside the U.S. and Canada, call 1-205-271-2985 or send us an email, etr@ewtn.com.
Well, we're back with the roundtable, a roundtable of two today. I'm here with Dr. William Anthony Thomas, a Mariologist from Ireland by birth, but from Rome by long association with the Pontificate of John Paul II and a member of the Pontifical International Marian Academy, which deals with issues of Marian theology and issues of apparitions, true versus false, and using the criterion of Catholic theology to make that discernment. So we'll take your questions on any of those kinds of issues that come to mind. And we do want to mention the phone numbers again. If you're in North America, 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-EWTN. Or if you're outside North America, country code 1-205-271-2985. 1-205-271-2985. And if you're watching on EWTN's radio Facebook or on our YouTube channel, you can ask questions in the boxes, comm boxes on those pages. So we were talking about the idea of the union of the hearts, and I think there's a way many times Catholics get accused of a sort of a somehow we are elevating Mary above her station, if you will. We don't believe that to be true, that God himself elevated her above our station, not Christ, for the role that she was to play in salvation history. But it's also important not to understand this union of hearts in a carnal way, because it deals with the supernatural virtues and the supernatural relationship by which we are also united to God. And therefore it has nothing of the carnal, except in her case that she herself was the mother of the Word made flesh.
Could I just answer the question of Jim on Saitun? Lest
Yeah.
I forget.
We forgot about
We've
Jim.
I didn't forget about him.
You didn't.
And
Good.
thanks for calling, Jim. So the situation as it stands is that the Coptic Orthodox accept the apparitions of El Situn in Egypt, in Cairo, in particular, as the home of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Holy Family, if you want. It's reputed that they lived in 3 different places in Cairo. But the Latins on the Catholic Church haven't made a decision on this. Now, I went there a couple of weeks ago, and I have written a preliminary report subject to some chemical analysis on the original images, and so I'm not going to preempt and say, but from our point of view, let's say, as Latins, we haven't made a decision on it, and I don't think that decision will be forthcoming because of the difficulties with the Coptic Orthodox and between the Coptic Orthodox and the Latins. The Coptic Orthodox do not accept, for example, the baptism of the Latins at all, which means none of their sacraments are valid. So you're into a political sphere here, and it would be wrong of me to make any judgment publicly on this. So I hope that answers your question.
Right, yeah. But we have this long-standing sort of toleration of it, but as to what that means more than simply this is their Marian issue, this isn't directly ours, we've not intervened in any way in it.
Now, going back to your question, the Holy Spirit has given many titles to Our Lady. The greatest title, of course, is Theotokos, the Mother of God. And this is the divine motherhood is the most fundamental principle of Mariology. If you're going to study Mariology, you must understand what the divine motherhood means. That God has prepared Our Lady, our heart was formed by the Trinity to be the proper abode, the immaculate abode for the enfleshment of God. And so this is absolutely. But the Holy Spirit has also given another title, and that is Stella Maris, the Star of the Sea. Now, this is a title that's often misunderstood. We think of the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. But in actual fact, the ocean we look at is the depth of the purity and the humility of Mary. In other words, it's a limitless depth. So she is Star of the Sea, and because she is so profoundly humble, then humility is the foundation, the rock, the pillar on which all virtues stand. And if your humility is perfect, then all of the virtues of Our Lady, the 10 principal virtues, most pure, most humble, most chaste, most holy, and so on, all kick in. And that way she mirrors what God wants of man. And we are obliged, in actual fact, to imitate her virtues. And so we really should study them to find out, because I go back to Fátima, that fundamental question of Fátima, will I go to heaven? And that's the ultimate destiny of each one of us. Will I go to heaven? How do I get there? Well, certainly prayer. But there's something very special about Fátima. Very, very special. As we see in the Old Testament, right to the New, this prefigurement, this woman has been kept hidden by God. She's referred to in Genesis as woman. Right to the New Testament, Jesus on the cross, looking at his own mother, says, "Woman, behold your son." He hides her. And really, down through the ages, many people have tried to control Our Lady. But in Fátima, she makes this remarkable statement. She said that God wishes to make me known and loved. This is the first time. 1917, God wishes to make me known and loved. And so what does that mean? It means that we must have some intellectual capacity to know who she is, to probe the depths of the relationship that Mary has with St. Joseph, the most chaste spouse, also a virgin, by the way, as opposed to what the Orthodox would say or the Anglicans would say, that he had been previously married. Joseph was a chaste virgin receiving special graces in the womb so that he didn't suffer from any concupiscence in his relationship with
And
Our
this
Lady.
was asserted clearly by John Paul II in
Redemptor
Redemptor
Custos, exactly.
yeah.
And, also in the other documents, Quam Pluries, for example, of Leo XIII, whom I hope a process is beginning now for his beatification, But anyway, in all of these things, it's very important to know that God has given us the gift of Our Lady as the new Eve, as the mother of the church, as the mother of each one of us. This is God giving us these great gifts, and we don't appreciate it. What many have tried to do, the separated brethren, is control her by trying to control at the Second Vatican Council titles that the church might have bestowed upon her. For example, Mater Ecclesiae, the mother of the church, and they wouldn't allow it. But Paul VI brought it in.
Took an intervention of a pope to put and remind people about mediatrix of grace.
Yes.
Was another one that nobody wanted to touch,
right.
but the Pope said no.
The Catholics want these titles. They want co-redemptrix, and they believe she is.
Right.
Her co-redemption is dependent on the Redeemer, not on her own accord, but dependent upon.
And the relationship, again, we keep going back to this sort of unity of history, that the relationship of Mary and her son in this aspect is like that of Adam and Eve. That you can't conceive of humanity whole and entire and redeemed unless you talk about God having done a recreation, if you will, of humanity. And having made them by means of creation initially, you can't do that again. So we have the woman who is herself a daughter of Eve, given this grace of the Immaculate Conception. The counterpoise to this, the failure of Eve to maintain her original innocence that she was given, that justice that the Lord placed in her soul at her creation, and Mary rather kept it.
Yes.
And we have to continually appreciate and understand that the redemption without consideration of Mary's role in it is only half of what man is, man and woman. I think an element of this is, which touch on briefly and then take some more questions, is this great comment of Cardinal Caffarra, who was the first head of the Pontifical Family Institute, who, when he was given that role back in 1982, I believe it was, he wrote to Sister Lucia just asking for her prayers, and she responded with a quite lengthy letter, some parts of which have been, he has spoken publicly on. He is since deceased. But the key thing is the battle of the times over marriage in the family. Well, if marriage in the family has played this central place, this communion of persons throughout history, it's unsurprising that as we inevitably at some point will approach the very end of history, that at some time this question again will be raised by the enemy of God and answered by God himself, and in this case through Our Lady.
If we could only understand 1% of what Our Lady is, we will see the most extraordinary creation of God, the most extraordinary person of Our Lady. And it's not about her. Catholics have often been accused of Marian adoration and so on and so forth. But I would say to anybody who says that, read what she says in this canticle of her soul, this Magnificat, as we call it. And in Latin, it's beautiful. Magnificat anima mea Dominum. My soul magnifies the Lord. I hope they get that.
Right.
It doesn't magnify myself, but it magnifies the Lord. It makes him more present in the world.
That's right.
It's not about herself. He has looked on his servant in her lowliness. She's not taking any airs or graces.
No.
But in humility, if we can practice humility, if we can become humble, God will give us anything we want. That is proven already.
Yeah. And I found it interesting that, in Luke's gospel, in his account of Mary arriving to visit her cousin Elizabeth, that the precursor of the Messiah leapt for joy, but he leapt for joy at the instrumentality of Our Lady's voice and his own mother's. The minute I heard your voice, the child leapt
In the womb.
in the womb.
Yes, yes.
God uses instruments.
Yes.
And Our Lady, to that extent, is an instrument of the redemption, but a fully active participant in it. Not the initiator, but the one who has fully said yes, fiat, to God's desire to redeem the world. Let's go to a caller. We've got Nicole in Pleasanton, Texas, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Good afternoon, Nicole. What's your question?
Hello. I wanted to ask, are there any Marian books you recommend about her apparitions and her message? I know there are several out there. I've read Our Lady of Quebec, and I wanted to know one. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, you've talked with me at least about this desire to make known the authentic apparitions that the Academy has.
Yeah.
But there are books already out there that are attempting to do that.
Well, there are some. We have to be careful in understanding Marian apparitions or Marian Mariophanies, as we call them, where there is no message, maybe just an appearance, as we had in Knock, where nothing was said, or in other places as well. But we must be careful, and I warn you, Nicole, and others who listen, be very careful about what we call Marian apocalypticism, where there is a terrible catastrophe coming down the road. Our Lady doesn't go in somewhere to frighten the horses and scare people. That's not the tactic. We must understand Marian eschatology, that Our Lady says, we are destined for heaven. We need to be converted if we want to go there. Here's the flames of hell for those who don't love God. But she asks us in charity to pray for them. And so we have to watch that. But your question is very valid. It's very good. And we have to be careful and discern what it is we are going to read. Does it have approval of the Church? That's very important.
And I would add this. There have been a lot of, growing up, I remember reading books, Father Walsh's book on Fátima, other books about Barreau and Barang, and some of the other approved apparitions. But Fátima, I think, has a unique place, and we've talked about this, that the account which Sister Lucia gave, of course, is part of the record. But then there is her book, The Calls of the Message of Fatima, in which she goes into in depth her own reflections on this. And I would say that her role is unique in the history of apparitions to this extent, that she was actually given the mission from Our Lady to be the expositor, the explainer of the Message of Fatima. So I would say read this book by Sister Lucia, The Calls, and you will understand better, at least, the Message of Fatima, which I think is the Lord's premier Marian apparition in history, at least from that point of view.
Yeah, Fatima is beyond doubt the most important Marian apparition to date, because in it, she comes on behalf of God, the mercy of God. She comes to call, as you said in the book, The Calls, written by Sister Lucia herself, over a period of years. It's a condensed, if you want, summary of all the questions she was asked about Fatima, and she was able to extrapolate or take from all of those questions the 26 calls of what Fatima call us: the call to believe, which is the most fundamental; the call to adore, because we believe we adore; the call to conversion; the call to prayer; the call to sacrifice, and so on and so forth. There are 26 calls built in. That book is readily available. You can get it on Amazon. I think it's about $8 or $9.
And, excuse me, Tony, religious catalog as well. We don't want to forget EWTN.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Yeah, okay, good.
So yeah, I would go right to the heart of what's needed today, and that certainly is the message of Fatima. Well, let's go to Chris in Akron, Ohio, listening on Living Bread Radio. Good afternoon, Chris.
Hi, how are you?
Pretty good. What's your question today?
So here's my question about Medjugorje. I had several years ago learned that that the church had not made a decision on Medjugorje, and still there are those who have gone to the site and claim to have witnessed things or experienced things that led to a growth in their faith. Some of them even saying, life-changing events, even what I would refer to as theologically sound priests that I've listened to or talked to. But at the same time, the church hasn't made a decision, number one. And then the second thing is that I've heard some things said about the lady who is the seer, some stories of how she had indicated that the Blessed Mother had spoke to her and affirmed the Muslim faith or something like that was completely off base, which made me think that this just can't possibly be all that it's cracked up to be. So I'd like to unpack that whole situation.
Sure, and get some sense of what's going on there. One simple historical correction, there have been, 2 or 3 decisions? There's just not been a papal decision.
Well, there were 2 theological commissions established by the Diocese of Mostar-Duvno, the first one in 1984 under Bishop Sanic, and the second one in 1992 under Bishop Ratko Peric. Both of them found the constant de non supernaturalitate. There's nothing of a supernatural nature happening in Medjugorje.
And there's not a condemnation per se in the church's language. It's just to say nothing supernatural here, whether it's pious behavior or fraud, it's making no decision about that.
As Mariologists, what we generally do is we look at 2 aspects of it, popular piety, and we look at actualities. In the case of Medjugorje, Pope Francis will not make a decision because he is a pastoral leader of the church, and he can see that many people are going to Medjugorje, albeit that it really attracts charismatics. More than anything else, and if that's what it takes, that's wonderful. Now, many people say there are many miracles. Well, the church has never declared a miracle in Medjugorje. Many people say there are many conversions. I would just say to that, there is a reawakening of the faith, that many people go there, have already been baptized or lapsed in their faith, and then they see this fervor and so on and so forth, and reawakening of vocations and so on and so forth. In the actualities, it's a completely different ball game. Now we're into serious doctrinal issues, dogmatic issues, spiritual issues in relation to the so-called 6 seers. And, I would say they own everything in Medjugorje. They own the hotels, they own the travel agencies, they've built their own churches on their own property. They are worth in excess of 4 billion euros. When you make the comparison with the children of Fátima or St. Bernadette Soubirous or some of the great saints of the church, Catherine Laboure, they entered the cloistered life. They became obscure. They became saints through the practice of the virtue.
Well, you were talking about the depth of humility of Our Lady.
Yeah.
It would lead, you would think, a seer to the depth of humility.
Exactly. So as a Mariologist, and I'll put my hand up and I say, I will never accept Medjugorje as authentic. Now, I speak on my own behalf, not on behalf of the Pontifical Academy or on behalf of the Holy Father, but I don't think he's in favor of it either, but he's not going to make a decision on it.
Yeah, and I think that's if you look at the actions that have been made by the Holy See, they are in favor of encouraging Marian devotion there, going back to the 90s under John Paul II. But they've always appended this authentic Marian devotion. That ought to be your first clue that they need to tell people that if you're going to Medjugorje, then practice authentic Marian devotion. And you don't need to go to Medjugorje to that. You can go to a local shrine. You can go to your parish church. You can go into your bedroom and pray.
Right.
So it doesn't really, So I think the many problems will probably not get resolved by the church, but it will be allowed to run its course as many things of that nature will do.
I mean, we do have an authentic Marian shrine here in the United States, of course, at Champion, Wisconsin. And, of course, we have Our Lady of the Americas, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And this is a beautiful, we have discovered music within the tilma most recently. And if we had time today, we would play it for you, but we don't. And wonderful things in our Marian studies. And I would encourage people, read Louis de Montfort's True Devotion to Mary, look at The Admirable Heart of Mary by St. John of Eudes, read about the glories of Mary through Alphonsus Liguori, and really study who she is. And I'll tell you what, there'll be a torrent of grace poured into your soul, and you will become so devoutly Catholic in mind and in heart and in love of the most beautiful of God's creation, the Blessed Virgin Mary.
And that'll get you to heaven, to
Absolutely.
the heart of God, as Sister Lucia says.
Not only that,
in one of her calls.
she will come for you.
Yes.
She will escort you to heaven.
Okay, I don't think we have time to take Judy as a caller, but the question of the Garabandal apparitions, which tolerance waxed and wanes, but now it's sort of in a, negative phase, I think.
The new Bishop of Santander will not tolerate it whatsoever. There were 4 theological commissions, and again, constat de non supernaturalitate.
Right.
Nothing of a supernatural nature. I heard a radio interview by Conchita Gonzalez, one of the children involved in the theatrics of walking backwards, which is really the only thing they had. She's now living in New York. And her youngest child, I think, was about 20 or 22. And the interviewer asked her, have you spoken to your children about these events in Garba? She never mentioned it. No. You see? So she never, none of them entered religious life. And, so it's a difficult, but it's not authentic. And many people, I find that the strangest thing, people will not go to authentic Marian shrines like Fátima or to Lourdes or to Rue de Bac, but they'll go to the ones that are not approved.
There seems to be something to that. Well, I guess we're not going to get time to talk to Carol, but she asks about Hail Full of Grace versus Hail Mary Full of Grace. That's simply something interpolated into the text, I think, and the vagaries of translation as well. But we'll have to take that on another show, so you can call back to Open Line next week, and we'll take that call at that time. Thank you for calling in today. I'm Colin Donovan. I've been here with Dr. William Thomas of the Pontifical International Marian Academy talking about Mary. So we hope that you will get yourself a great book on Our Lady, like The Calls by Sister Lucia Fátima, and get to know her more and more as a central feature of your own spiritual life. Until next time, God bless.